A metal door. Heavy. Painted brown. 2 locks. And an extra latch installed from the inside. Not a prison. Not a government building. A normal apartment in the Soviet Union. By the 1970s, millions of families lived behind doors like this. Standardized housing blocks. Identical corridors. Thin walls. And doors that closed harder than they needed to. The extra latch was rarely part of the original design. Residents added it themselves. Not to stop burglars. Burglary was not the main fear. Most apartments contained little worth stealing. Scarcity was universal. Furniture looked similar everywhere. The sound that mattered was different. A knock. In most countries, a knock is neutral. A visitor. A delivery. A neighbor asking for sugar. In the Soviet Union, a knock carried structure. Because the door did not separate private life from the outside world. It separated private life from the state. Soviet apartment blocks were designed for efficiency. Prefabricated concrete panels. Stacked units. Shared plumbing lines. Minimal insulation. The goal was scale. Entire districts rose quickly. Rows of identical entrances. Rows of identical stairwells. Rows of identical doors. From above, the repetition suggested order. From inside, it produced proximity. When walls are thin, sound travels. A chair dragged across the floor. A radio slightly too loud. A late-night conversation. When hallways are shared, movement becomes visible. You see who returns late. Who leaves early. Who receives visitors. Who carries unfamiliar newspapers. When doors align along identical corridors, individuality fades. Privacy becomes architectural fiction. And then there was another layer. Informal observation. Not every building had a full-time security presence. It did not need one. The system relied on density. Neighbors noticed who left late. Who received visitors. Who listened to foreign radio. Who spoke too carefully. No one announced this role. It emerged from structure. When the state defines loyalty as survival, silence becomes social currency. And the door becomes a threshold not just of space, but of speech. People learned what to say inside. What not to say near the hallway. When to lower their voice. The extra latch was mechanical. But the adaptation was psychological. Stand in the corridor for a moment. Do not move. Listen. A kettle begins to whistle behind one door. A cough behind another. A chair scrapes concrete. A faucet runs. Then stops. Footsteps approach from the stairwell. They slow. They pass. Somewhere, a radio lowers itself by a few degrees. Not to silence. Just enough. Nothing is said. But the building registers everything. The knock itself was ordinary. 3 or 4 strikes. Firm. Not aggressive. Measured. There were many reasons someone might knock. A census check. A building inspector verifying occupancy. A district official reviewing housing allocation. A request to clarify employment records. Most knocks were procedural. Most visits ended without incident. But unpredictability does not require frequency. It requires possibility. You did not need a security officer at every door. You needed the idea that one might come. And you needed the awareness that walls were thin. The Soviet system did not rely solely on visible repression. It relied on distributed limits. Writers, engineers, teachers. Many lived ordinary lives. They worked. They queued for groceries. They attended meetings. But they understood boundaries. Foreign magazines were kept inside drawers. Letters were stored carefully. Radio dials were adjusted slowly at night. Conversations paused when someone approached the door. Not out of panic. Out of calibration. The latch was not about force. It was about delay. A few seconds to rearrange a table. To fold a newspaper. To close a book. To lower a voice. Architecture gave seconds. Structure shaped behavior. Someone stands up. Not quickly. Just enough. The latch slides. Metal on metal. The door opens only a hand's width. A chain holds. Or a second lock. A face in the corridor stays neutral. A paper is visible for a second. A stamp. A line to sign. A short exchange. Few words. No explanation. The door closes. The latch returns. And the apartment becomes quiet again. By the late Soviet period, overt terror was not daily reality for most citizens. The mass purges were decades earlier. But systems evolve. Instead of visible repression, the structure became ambient. Predictable employment. Predictable housing. Predictable shortages. Predictable boundaries. The knock did not have to happen often. It only had to remain plausible. And plausibility is enough to change behavior. Children grew up watching adults pause when someone stood outside the door. That pause was instruction. Not spoken. Not explained. Absorbed. The system did not need to enter every apartment. It needed to be considered before every conversation. Before every joke. Before every opinion. Before every guest. In that environment, the extra lock becomes symbolic, but not theatrical. It is a small mechanical addition to a standardized door. Installed quietly. Never officially required. But widely adopted. A private adjustment to a public structure. And once that adjustment becomes normal, the structure no longer needs to knock loudly. The radio is already on. Not loud. Never loud. A hand reaches toward the dial. Not to turn it off. Just to bring it down slightly. A fraction. The gesture is small enough to look accidental. Small enough to deny intention. The voice on the radio continues. The room continues. But the adjustment remains. Today, many of those apartment blocks still stand. The doors have been repainted. The locks replaced. But in older neighborhoods across the former Eastern Bloc, you can still find doors with double mechanisms. An official lock. And a second device added later. Sometimes newer. Sometimes older. Sometimes repainted over. It tells a quiet story. Not of constant intrusion, but of anticipation. The Soviet Union built millions of apartments to solve a housing crisis. And in doing so, it built an architecture where private space remained structurally uncertain. The door closed. But it never fully separated the inside from the system outside. Because when a society installs an extra lock from the inside, it is not protecting space. It is adapting to structure. Look at the door closely. Paint over paint. Old screws. A second mechanism that does not match the first. It was added later. Quietly. Without paperwork. Without permission. A modification repeated across millions of apartments is no longer personal. It becomes pattern. And when patterns appear in hardware, they are no longer opinions. They are structure.